He had all the money in the world, but one question kept him awake at night. Do they love me, or do they love my money? So he pretended to be sick. Very sick. What his family did next revealed a truth he was never ready to face. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Richard Coleman had everything most people only dreamed of. A private jet waited for him at the airport. His mansion sat on a hill, shining with glass walls and golden lights. His name opened doors in boardrooms across the country. At 62, Richard was one of the richest men in the city. Yet, on that quiet night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the city lights below, feeling more afraid than he had ever felt in his life. It was not death he feared. It was the thought of dying alone. Earlier that day, Richard had attended the funeral of an old business partner. The man had been wealthy too, powerful, respected. But as Richard stood by the grave, something had shocked him. Only a few people had come. No children, no loving wife, just lawyers and business associates. That image refused to leave Richard's mind. What if this is how it ends for me? He whispered. At home, his mansion was always full of people, his wife, his children, relatives, staff. Laughter echoed in the hallways. Smiles followed him wherever he went. But suddenly, all of it felt uncertain. Did they truly love him? Or did they love the life his money provided? Richard had been married to his wife, Margaret, for 35 years. She was elegant, always well-dressed, always polite. Their children, Daniel, Chloe, and Victor, had grown up with every comfort. Private schools, luxury vacations, expensive cars. Richard had given them everything. But had he ever tested their hearts? That night, sleep refused to come. He replayed small moments in his head. How conversations stopped when he entered a room. How his children rarely visited unless they needed something. How his wife often checked her phone when he spoke. None of it was loud. None of it was cruel. But it was enough to raise doubt. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He called his personal doctor, Dr. Harris, a man he trusted deeply. "I need your help," Richard said calmly. The doctor listened as Richard explained his plan. When Richard finished, Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, concern written all over his face. "This is risky," he warned. "Not medically, but emotionally." "I know," Richard replied, "but I need the truth." They agreed on the story. A serious illness. Nothing immediate, but serious enough to cause fear. Hospital visits, medications, long conversations about the future. That evening, Richard returned home earlier than usual. His face was pale. His steps were slower. Margaret noticed immediately. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. Richard forced a weak smile. "We need to talk." They sat in the living room, the space glowing softly under the chandelier. His children soon joined them, curiosity on their faces. Richard took a deep breath. "I've been unwell," he said. "The doctor says it's serious." Silence fell. Daniel frowned. Chloe's eyes widened. Victor leaned back, arms crossed. "How serious?" Margaret asked. Richard lowered his voice. "Serious enough to make me think about the future." No one spoke. Richard watched them closely, their faces, their movements, their silence. In that moment, he felt something cold settle in his chest. This was only the beginning, and whatever truth waited ahead, he knew it would hurt more than any illness ever could. The house felt different the next morning. Richard noticed it the moment he came downstairs. The usual warmth in the air was gone, replaced by a strange tension that clung to every corner of the mansion. The servants moved more quietly than usual. Voices dropped when he entered a room. Everyone knew. Margaret was already seated at the dining table, scrolling through her phone. When she saw Richard, she quickly placed it face down. "You should be resting," she said, standing up. "The doctor said you need to avoid stress." Her words sounded caring, but her eyes were distracted. Richard smiled faintly and sat down. "I feel fine today." She nodded, but her attention drifted toward the staircase, as if waiting for someone. Daniel appeared first. His tie was already on, briefcase in hand. "Morning, Dad," he said quickly. "I heard about your health." Richard studied him. "Yes, it's worrying." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Well, you're strong. You'll be fine." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting in 30 minutes, Daniel added. "But if you need anything, let me know." Richard nodded. "Of course." Daniel kissed Margaret's cheek and hurried out of the house. Chloe came down next, dressed neatly, her phone in her hand. She walked over and hugged Richard lightly. "That must be scary," she said. "Have you told your lawyer?" The question landed harder than Richard expected. "Not yet," he replied carefully. Chloe nodded thoughtfully. "You probably should, just in case." Just in case. Victor arrived last, casual as always, chewing gum. "So it's true?" he asked. "You're sick?" "Yes," Richard said. Victor shrugged. "That's life. We all get sick." Margaret shot him a sharp look. "Victor!" "What?" he replied. "I'm just being honest." Breakfast ended quickly. One by one they left the table, each with an excuse. Work, appointments, errands. Richard was left alone again. Later that day, Dr. Harris visited the house for a routine checkup. The family gathered in the sitting room, listening closely as the doctor spoke in careful, serious tones. "We'll need more tests," Dr. Harris said. "This condition can change lives." Margaret clasped her hands together. "How long does he have?" Richard felt his heart skip. Dr. Harris paused. "It's too early to say." That night, Richard pretended to sleep early, but he did not sleep. From his bedroom, he heard whispers in the hallway. Soft voices, careful footsteps. Margaret's voice drifted through the door. "If anything happens," she said quietly, "we need to be prepared." Daniel replied, "I'll talk to the lawyer." Chloe added, "Make sure the accounts are secure." Richard closed his eyes tightly. His chest felt heavy, not from illness but from realization. They were already planning life without him, and the test had only just begun. Richard stayed in bed longer than usual the next morning, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to listen. Through the half-closed door, he heard Margaret moving around the room. She was quiet, careful, almost distant. When she finally noticed that Richard was awake, she smiled politely, the way one smiles at a guest. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. "Weak," Richard replied softly. She nodded. "That's expected." She handed him his pills with a glass of water, then sat at the edge of the bed. For a moment Richard thought she might hold his hand, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up. "I have a lunch meeting," she said, "but I've told the staff to check on you." Richard looked at her. "Will you be back soon?" She hesitated. "I'll see." The door closed gently behind her. That simple moment hurt more than he expected. Later in the afternoon, Richard walked slowly through the house. He leaned on his cane, pretending to struggle. He passed the living room and stopped when he heard Margaret's voice. She was on the phone. "Yes, I know," she said quietly. "If things go badly, I'll need protection." She paused, listening. "I've stood by him for years. I deserve security." Richard's hand trembled. That evening, Margaret returned home dressed elegantly, her hair perfect, her face calm. She placed her handbag on the table and spoke gently. "How was your day?" "Lonely," Richard answered honestly. She smiled faintly. "You must stay positive." At dinner, she barely ate. Her mind seemed far away. When Richard spoke, she listened, but not deeply. Her replies were short, careful. After dinner, she excused herself early. "I'm tired," she said. Richard stayed behind, staring at the empty chair across from him. 35 years. He remembered when she used to wait up late just to hear his voice, when she worried over small fevers, when she cried at the thought of losing him. Now her tears were gone. That night, Richard received a message on his phone. It was from his housekeeper, Grace. "Sir, if you need anything, I am here." Just one sentence. But it felt warmer than everything else that day. Richard lay back on his bed, eyes open in the dark. The illness was fake, but the loneliness was real. And he was beginning to understand something painful. Love, when tied too closely to comfort, often fades when fear enters the room. Richard decided it was time to watch more closely. The next morning, he asked the staff to leave him alone in the living room. He sat quietly on his favourite chair, a blanket over his legs, his breathing slow and weak. From there, he could hear almost everything. Daniel arrived first. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile, "how are you feeling today?" "Not very strong," Richard replied. "I've been thinking about the company." Daniel's eyes lit up slightly. "The company?" "Yes," Richard said. "In case I need someone to take charge." Daniel sat up straighter. "Well, I've always been ready to help. You know that." Richard nodded. "Of course." Daniel spoke quickly after that, about expansion plans, new contracts, and board meetings. Not once did he ask about Richard's pain or fear. When his phone rang, he stood up immediately. "I'll check on you later," he said. He never did. Chloe visited in the afternoon. She brought flowers, placed them neatly on the table, and took several photos with Richard. "These will be nice memories," she said softly. Memories. She asked about the house, the jewellery, the vacation property overseas. "I just want to understand things better," she explained, "so nothing goes wrong." Richard smiled, his heart aching. "You're very organised," she laughed lightly. "Someone has to be." Victor came last, late in the evening. He dropped onto the sofa and sighed. "This whole sickness thing is stressing everyone out," he said. "I can't even sleep properly." "I'm sorry," Richard replied quietly. Victor shrugged. "Just get better soon, okay?" That night, Richard sat alone again. 3 children. 3 different visits. Not one question about how afraid he was. Not one offer to stay. But from the doorway, Grace appeared. "Sir," she said gently, "I brought you some soup." She set it beside him and adjusted the blanket over his legs. "You don't have to do this," Richard said. She smiled softly. "I want to." As she walked away, Richard felt tears fill his eyes. The test was revealing more than he ever expected, and his heart was breaking, piece by piece. Richard stopped pretending to be strong. That morning he allowed his hands to shake. He moved slower than before. He let the pain show on his face, even though it was not real. He wanted to see who would notice, not because they had to, but because they cared. Margaret had already left the house before he woke up. Daniel sent a short message. "Busy day. Talk later." Chloe posted a smiling photo online. Victor didn't call at all. But Grace came. She knocked softly before entering his room. "Good morning, sir," she noticed immediately. "You look worse today," she said, concern filling her eyes. "I don't feel well," Richard admitted. She helped him sit up, adjusted his pillows and brought him warm tea. She did not rush. She did not check her phone. She sat beside the bed. "You don't have to be afraid," Grace said gently. "You are not alone." The words hit Richard like a wave. No one had said that to him since he claimed to be sick. Later that day, Richard pretended to collapse slightly while walking in the hallway. His cane slipped from his hand. Grace was the first to run toward him. She called for help, held his arm, and helped him sit down. Her hands trembled, not from fear of responsibility, but fear for him. When Margaret heard, she rushed in, but only after several minutes. "What happened?" she asked sharply. "I felt dizzy," Richard said. Margaret sighed in relief when Dr. Harris said he was stable. That night, Grace stayed nearby. "I lost my husband years ago," she told Richard quietly. "Illness shows people's hearts. Some stay, some run." Richard swallowed hard. He looked at her and realized something painful but clear. The one who cared most for him was not family by blood. And that truth would soon change everything. Richard knew the truth was almost complete. Now all he had to do was listen. He asked Dr. Harris to increase the seriousness of the illness. More visits, more warning signs, more fear. the kind of fear that reveals what people hide in their hearts. That evening, Richard stayed in his room, the door slightly open. Margaret's voice floated from the hallway. "This can't go on," she said in a low tone. "Everything is uncertain." Daniel replied, "We need control. The company can't wait." Chloe added softly, "If anything happens suddenly, we'll be unprepared." No one mentioned Richard's comfort. No one asked how he felt. Richard closed his eyes. Later, Margaret entered his room with a forced smile. "The doctor says things could change quickly," she said. "We should talk about arrangements." "Arrangements?" Richard asked weakly. "Yes," she continued, "the will, the assets, just to protect everyone." Richard nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. That night, Grace brought him dinner. "You didn't eat much today," she noticed. "I had no appetite," Richard replied. She sat beside him quietly. "Sir," she said after a moment, "no matter what happens, your life mattered. You helped many people. You are not forgotten." Tears filled Richard's eyes. After she left, Richard reached for his phone and opened a hidden folder. Recordings, notes, dates, conversations. He had written everything down, every word, every reaction, every silence. The test was over. What remained was the hardest part. Richard asked for everyone to be present the next morning. The message was simple. Family meeting. Important. Margaret arrived first, dressed carefully, her face calm, but tense. Daniel came next, already on his phone. Chloe followed, whispering to someone before ending her call. Victor arrived last, looking annoyed. Grace stood quietly near the door. Richard entered slowly, supported by his cane. He looked weak, fragile, nothing like the powerful billionaire they all knew. "I don't have much strength," Richard said, his voice low, "so I'll speak quickly." Everyone leaned forward. "I've been sick for weeks," he continued, "and during that time, I learned many things." Margaret reached for his hand. He gently pulled away. "I learned who stays when fear enters the room," Richard said, "and who plans ahead instead." Daniel shifted in his seat. Chloe frowned. "What do you mean, Dad?" Richard took a deep breath. The illness was not real. Silence exploded. "What?" Margaret gasped. "You lied?" Victor asked sharply. "I tested you," Richard said calmly, "because I needed the truth." Anger filled the room. "That's cruel," Margaret said. "Unforgivable." Richard nodded. "Perhaps, but honesty often hurts." He turned toward Grace. "She stayed," he said, "when others counted time and money." Margaret's face hardened. Richard straightened slightly. "I have changed my will." The room froze. "I will give my wealth to those who showed love, not expectation." Daniel stood up. "You can't do this." "I already have," Richard replied. Grace looked shocked. "You taught me something important," Richard said to his family. "Money reveals hearts. Illness reveals souls." No one spoke. The truth had been spoken, and there was no going back. The room stayed silent long after Richard finished speaking. Margaret's face was pale. Daniel stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Chloe slowly sat back down, her confidence gone. Victor looked away, ashamed but still unwilling to speak. Grace's hands trembled. "Sir, I don't understand," she said softly. "I didn't do anything special." Richard looked at her with gentle eyes. "You did everything that mattered." He turned back to his family. "I did not pretend to be sick because I hate you," he said calmly. "I did it because I was afraid. Afraid that when my time truly comes, I would be surrounded by money. But not love." Margaret's voice broke. "I was scared too." Richard nodded. "Fear shows us who we really are." He explained the changes clearly. His wife and children would still be provided for. Homes, monthly support, security. But control of the company and most of his wealth would go into a foundation. Grace would lead it with trusted professionals. "This money will help people who care without asking what they will gain," Richard said. Tears filled Chloe's eyes. "We failed you." "Yes," Richard replied gently. but failure can teach, if you allow it. The weeks that followed were quiet. The family changed, not immediately, not perfectly, but slowly. Margaret began to visit Richard without her phone. Daniel stayed longer listening instead of talking. Chloe stopped asking questions about money. Victor apologized one evening, his voice low and unsure. Grace remained the same, kind, steady, present. One afternoon, Richard sat in the garden, sunlight warming his face. Grace stood beside him, watering the flowers. "You're smiling," she noticed. "I feel lighter," Richard said. "The truth does that." He looked around his home, not as a fortress of wealth, but as a place of lessons learned. Richard Coleman was still a billionaire, but more importantly, he was no longer alone.